last week on Legally Kidnapped.
Good evening. Our top story this week. A group is accusing Dr. Phil of giving false and reckless testimony regarding domestic violence to the Senate Judiciary Committee. In Connecticut this week, DCF claims to be complying with a 2002 class action settlement regarding mental health treatment for kids, even though kids are still getting injured while being restrained in residential treatment facilities, and neighbors are concerned about the constant police presence at a group home for teenage boys. California is having a hard time providing for the health care needs of foster kids, and although the resource isn't used nearly enough, California grandparents help to keep foster care numbers down. In Florida this week, the grand jury urges better training for child protective workers, criticizing them for their incompetence, and saying that they were too trusting of the parents in the case of a 10-year-old girl named Nubia Barahona who was tortured and murdered at the hands of her adoptive parents. Meanwhile, the great leader of DCF makes the case that children are safer thanks to changes prompted by Nubia's death, and the state refuses $50 million from the federal government, which was supposed to go to child abuse prevention, by blocking Obamacare from entering the state. The state of Georgia has been chosen for a national study regarding the legal representation of children in the foster care system. Massachusetts considers the banning of shock therapy on children. Privately run foster care agencies in Nebraska don't think that they're being paid enough, thus proving that Nebraska's transition from a state-run to private-run child welfare system is a complete and utter disaster, already costing 50% more than originally estimated. In Kentucky, the number of grandparents who are raising kids is on the rise. A family court judge gets the job of running the child protective industry in New York City after the commissioner of ACS resigns. In Illinois, more dioceses are joining into the fight to keep Catholic Charities' foster care business running without having to cave into the gay rights issue. And zero-tolerance policies are causing a high number of kids to drop out of school, prompting the state to look at its discipline policies. International adoptions are on the decline in the USA as more desperate to adopt parents look towards the foster care system as their only hope for a child. A new study finds that children and families are better served when judges follow a set of guidelines during an initial removal hearing. In Utah, budget cuts are being blamed on a cut in domestic violence investigation where a child was involved, and Indiana starts targeting families with sibling rivalries by warning parents to watch out for sibling abuse. In North Carolina, the Durham County Social Services Director is fired for the unsatisfactory handling of the custody of two children. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi tells presidential candidate Michelle Bachmann to address the disturbing trend of teen suicides within her own district. A researcher from Michigan finds that smacking children helps their development, and kids who are punished in Texas public schools are more likely to enter the juvenile justice system. In Cambodia this week, concern is growing over what is called orphan tourism. In China, 89 kids who were rescued from human trafficking ring will be placed into foster care instead of being allowed to stay with the people who bought them. In India, a little girl can't go to school because her adoptive parents can't get a birth certificate. And in Germany, the child protective industry considers snatching the kids of neo-Nazis in order to prevent them from being brainwashed into worshipping Hitler's Third Reich. In New Zealand, adoption laws apparently violate the country's anti-discrimination laws. Russia tries to pawn a few orphans off on the citizens of Toledo, Ohio, and Ireland is still failing its foster children, as a group of Irish foster kids gets together to voice their frustrations, and access to birth parents and siblings are one of the main issues identified by kids in state care. In Australia this week, the Catholic Church issues an apology over its forced adoption practices from the 1950s through the 70s. The General Assembly wants tough new sanctions in place against parents who take their kids overseas against the will of the other, and an Australian couple wins the right to custody of kids born to a surrogate mothers in Thailand, but faces prosecution for entering into a commercial surrogacy agreement. In Canada, a new study reveals that children whose parents grow marijuana are more likely to do better, to be better fed, and stay in school by staying with their parents, thus questioning Canada's policy of automatically removing these kids from their homes. In England this week, a group home is under investigation for child abuse. A British watchdog group announces no-notice inspections of the child protective industry. An adopted girl helps murder her foster mother, and a visit from the Pope sparks a rash of sexual abuse allegations against the church. A children's services boss apologizes to children who were abused by their adoptive mother. Monmouthshire Council will pay a real father £5,000 after a foster parent took £8,000 that was meant for his child. A British social worker gets 13 years in jail for sexual abuse. And police in Nottingham get a report of a baby in a hot car, then smash out the window only to find a doll. In entertainment news this week, Monster Garage star Jesse James gets full custody of his daughter Sunny. Neil Patrick Harris goes on The Daily Show and makes a joke about stapling children to their crib cribs. Charlie Sheen considers filing for full custody again as Brooke Mueller goes into rehab, even though he hasn't seen the kids in weeks. And the Octomom claims that she needed 14 kids to fill an emotional void. In New York this week, a caseworker pleads guilty to felony neglect, where an infant with a digestive disorder nearly died last year. In Michigan, prosecutors are pressing charges against a group of juvenile court workers who are accused of misusing county vehicles and taking part in recreational activities when they were supposed to be working. The Oklahoma City cop who stands accused of molesting 4 of his foster children hands in his resignation notice to the police department. A former foster parent from Missouri is found guilty of child molestation. A Mississippi man gets life plus 35 years in prison for sex crimes committed when he was a foster parent. And a man from Florida is accused of caging his adopted son. In Kentucky, a social worker loses her $1.2 million bid against the child protective industry in a whistleblower case after state officials made her job unbearable when she tried to report her supervisor's wrongdoings. The Michigan mother who is accused of shooting at cops during an illegal state-sponsored child snatching goes to court to face charges. A boy who was held captive and abused inside a California foster home for a year is suing the child protective industry for failing to keep him safe. In Illinois, a 12-year-old boy tries to escape from foster care, steals a minivan, crashes it, and dies. A restaurant in Pennsylvania bans kids under 6. And finally, tonight in Texas, the sexual abuse trial of FLDS leader Warren Jeffs begins with a statement from God warning of sickness and death for prosecutors as a child protective worker begins her testimony in regards to the snatching of 400 kids back in 2008. For these stories and all the latest dirt on the child protective industry, visit www.legallykidnapped.com. And until next week, this is Baby LK, over and out.